Welcome, everybody. I'm Don Ross, president of the Thousand Islands Watershed Land Trust, or TIWLT for short. This is our first conservation cafe of 2024. We're renaming our cafe from science to conservation because really conservation is at the core of what we do. TIWLT works in the 1,000 square kilometre region of eastern Ontario where the waters, streams, wetlands, and rivers flow into the Thousand Islands and the St. Lawrence River. This is part of the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabeg, and Wendat peoples. Our nonprofit organization deeply respects these lands and waters and works for their protection, as had First Nations peoples for millennia. The Land Trust is now into our 31st years. Looking back, the first years were pretty interesting because it was such a new concept. Even the legislation didn't exist then for people to make donations of land and easements possible. But the last couple of decades have been really quite active, and it's getting more and more so. There's a generational change taking place. On one end of the spectrum, properties are being sold or handed down to the next generation. And at the younger end, there's quite a tremendous interest from people who really want to do something about biodiversity loss, climate change, and the outdoors. All this has really changed the way this organization works. We find ourselves more and more into the education side of things now because to protect something, you really need to understand it. And with understanding often comes the love of things and our sense of place. This drives conservation today. We're going to be doing quite a bit more education on conservation and conservation itself. So a lot of people have been asking us over the last couple of years, how do you do this? What's involved? What makes conservation work and stick? Can government take it away? All sorts of questions. So TIWLT will be doing a large in-person event on conservation, bringing in subject experts and so forth into the Charleston Lake area on June 22nd. So mark that date and watch our social channels and websites for more. Okay, it's time to introduce Calder Schweitzer, our executive director, to talk about what TIWLT does at its conservation core. So take it away, Calder.
I'm so glad to be back here doing these conservation talks, and I want to thank all of you for joining us for our first Conservation Cafe of 2024. I am, of course, going to be talking about the Conservation Toolbox, sort of an overview of the core of TIWLT's work and how we get it done. It's Conserving Land with the Land Trust 101. There is a ton of content we have to get through in an hour, so I'm just going to get right into it.
The first thing that you have to understand about when we're talking about this is the Ecological Gifts Program. This is the place that I'm starting because this underpins so much of the work that we do here at the Land Trust when it comes to conserving ecologically sensitive property. And actually, it's Marnie who really puts it in a fantastic way. The necessity for this program in the first place, because Marnie says back in the day when the organization first started, you could donate a painting or a picture of a gorgeous forest or a lake or a piece of ecologically sensitive property, and you would get a tax receipt for the donation of that painting or photograph. But if you actually donated the piece of property itself to be conserved, you wouldn't get anything like that. And so the Ecological Gifts Program kind of comes in to solve that problem. It gives private citizens a way to work with members of their community, really, which is what land trusts are at their core. It gives these citizens the opportunity to work with the land trusts to turn their privately held rural property into gorgeous protected areas that are protected forever. Now, it is simple in concept, but complicated in practice and implementation. It's a federal program that is under the CRA, but is delivered by Environment and Climate Change Canada. And it's also enabled in part by the Ontario Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. So there are a lot of moving pieces to this, but the benefits are absolutely worth it. Most of the work that we do at TIWLT goes through the Ecological Gifts Program. However, it's not required to go through this program in order to conserve a property. Any property that TIWLT comes to own, whether we purchase it or if it's donated outside of the Ecological Gifts Program, is land that can go into conservation under the Land Trust. So this isn't the only avenue. But the reason I wanted to start off by talking about the Ecological Gifts Program is because it gives a really, really good outline of a good process of donating property, to the point where with TIWLT, even for the projects that don't go through the ecological gifts program, for the donations that come to us independently of this program, we still follow their system, their process almost to a T, because the checks and balances throughout it, and the documentation that we create as part of it by doing that, is really, really useful organizationally, and it lays everything out really nicely. So I think this is a fantastic program. We're going to talk a little bit about this second bullet point here, the significant tax breaks for the donation of ecologically sensitive land, because it really that is maybe the best part of the program, beyond just the concept behind it. We're going to get to that, but let's zoom out and really take an overview look at this process. And this is the process that TIWLT goes through every time we want to conserve a property. And it can be broken down very broadly into 3 key steps. The first one is notification and discovery. This is where, very broadly, a piece of land comes across, my desk or Don's desk or Maggie's desk, and somebody is interested in conserving a piece of property. Most of the time, these people seek us out. These are people that want to conserve their property, that see the land trust as an avenue to do that. But occasionally, the land trust will also seek out individuals with exceptional pieces of property to see if they'd be interested in conservation. Once we have a piece of property and a landowner interested in the process, and we've talked to them about the best way to conserve for them to meet their needs, we move on to ecological assessment. And this is the fun part, to be perfectly honest. This is the part where we get to go out as biologists. That's what my training is in. And we get to tromp around in the woods and flip over logs and walk through the muck and all sorts of things, looking for species at risk and landscape level features and sensitive ecosystems and all sorts of things. I'm going to show you a list of all the things we look for later. And this is where we really prove not to just the government, but we also prove to ourselves and to our supporters that the properties that we are protecting are worth protecting. Once we go through the ecological assessment, it comes time to do all of the fun paperwork. And this is the part that I call appraisal and submission. This is the part where we calculate how much the tax credit is going to be worth. And we also go back and forth quite a bit with the ecological gifts program, with several pieces of paperwork to make sure that everybody is happy, everything makes sense, and everybody knows what they need to do and when come the end of the project to claim those sweet, sweet tax credits. So let's take a look at notification and discovery. As I said, occasionally TIWLT will approach landowners, but the vast majority of our properties are ones that come to us. These are landowners who wish to conserve their land for one reason or another. And most often, this is because of a deep connection with the land. It's a piece of property that's maybe been in their family for a long time, or a piece of property that they love. Maybe they grew up on it. And so often we see people with these gorgeous pieces of property that are getting to the point in their life when they're ready to dispose of them. And they don't want to see them turned into a subdivision or a parking lot or something like that. And so they come to TIWLT as the people who can solve that problem for them and offer them conservation of their property. And it's always such an honoring prospect. I always feel so good when people approach TIWLT with these ideas, because it's a show of generosity that it never gets old. It's incredible to see people entering into these arrangements. The other thing is, a lot of people, when they start this process, don't exactly know everything that it entails. They will not have had the benefit of attending this session because we've never run it before. And so the first thing that we always do with landowners when they approach us looking to conserve their property is we sit down for a no pressure chat. We outline the process, we outline the benefits, and we outline the costs. And if at the end of that chat, the landowners are excited and enthused and ready to go, then we'll move right along. Sometimes they need some time to think. Sometimes they realize that it's not actually what they thought it was, and it's not something they want to pursue. All of those outcomes are totally fine for us. We want people to make the decision that is best for their property. The other thing that we talk about when we are having this discussion is the actual mechanism that they're going to be donating through. There are a number of ways that you can actually donate land. And I'm going to outline those in the next slide, but there really are, it's kind of an astounding actually number of options that people have when they want to protect a piece of property. And there are a lot of really customizable ways that people can get that done and really feel good about the decision that they've made. This is also one of my favorite parts of the process because we get to talk to people about why they love their property. And that's really the first question that I always like to ask when we sit down for these conversations is just ask them, what do you love about the property? What is it that you want to protect? And what, why are you interested in this? And the stories that people tell will just absolutely warm your heart. And the generosity that they're displaying in coming to do this is amazing. We've had a lot of people that come to have this conversation with us. They want to donate a piece of property, and they didn't even know there was a tax break involved, and they're just looking to conserve their property. And so it's a really rewarding part of the process right out of the gate. So, what are the ways that we can actually donate property? We're going to give you the Coles Notes version, and there are three main ways with a few sub options within them, and that's going to make sense in a second, I promise. The first option is what's called a fee simple donation, and this is the most straightforward one. This is just a straight up donation of the property. The donor receives a tax credit that is based on the appraised value of the land, and after the transfer, the land trust becomes the new owner and stewards the property forever. As the new landowner, the land trust takes on all of the burdens of the land that any other private landowner would take on as well. We are responsible for paying property taxes on all of our properties, unless we're able to successfully apply for things like the Conservation Land Tax Incentive Program or the Managed Forest Tax Incentive Program. We're also responsible for stewarding those properties as any prudent landowner would, keeping an eye out for things like invasive species and things like trespass issues and things like that. We really are in a lot of ways in the eyes of the law, we're a private individual or private organization that is owning this property. The caveat is that once it comes into our hands, once it's been donated to us, through the Ecological Gifts Program, we are not allowed to sell that property. That's a property that we are signing up to steward forever. Now, if the property comes to us and it doesn't go through the Ecological Gifts Program and it's a donation outside of the program, technically the land trust is allowed to sell it, but that's really under extreme situations. And gifts that are donated for ecological value are not things that the land trust would ever consider selling. Anything that we might do that for would be something that's donated with the intent of the land trust selling it to generate money to do further conservation work. So whether it's we're legally precluded from doing it or just organizationally precluded from doing it because of our values and our mission statement, land that is donated to us through this fee simple donation, once it's in the hands of TIWLT, is protected forever. Now, there are a couple of options that go along with the fee simple donation, and you'll see them down at the bottom. One is something called a life lease, which we do every now and then. And this comes into play when we have a landowner that wants to donate a piece of property, but isn't quite finished using it in some way. And we can have arrangements set up with them that allow them to continue using that property while it's being protected by TIWLT, provided that the ways that they're using it aren't harmful to the property itself. The best example I have of this is we actually did a property, I think it closed in 2021, and it had a large, but 57 acres or so, I believe, great, large, pristine forest. But the landowner had a couple of vegetable gardens on the property that they had used for years to feed themselves. They grew vegetables there. They froze them, ate them all through the winter, and they wanted this property to go to conservation, but they also wanted to still be able to do that and use that land to feed themselves. And so we worked out a deal with them whereby they donated the property. and are continued to be allowed to use those gardens to grow vegetables and use them as they had when they were the legal owners of it. And that's the kind of idea of a life lease. They can be as complicated or as simple as you need them to be. That one was fairly simple, so we really just have a written agreement. We have another property that was donated that actually had a house on it, and the individual wanted to continue living in their house, but also wanted the property to go into conservation. And so we set up a life lease whereby, we are now the owners of the house, but we rent it back to that landowner for an amount that just covers the tax and the insurance on it. I have to ask you. I have to ask your apologies briefly. I may stop to cough or something like that. I'm just getting over a cold, as it seems like everybody in the province is right now. So my apologies if I have to pause for that occasionally. The other option that we have when it comes to donations in this fee simple way is a partial donation, or something called a split receipt. And this is a case where an individual is looking to conserve a property, but for some reason they're not able to commit to a full donation of the property. And so they want to sell a portion of it and donate a portion of it. And the way this works is essentially we get the property appraised, and they would sell the property to the land trust for a percentage of the fair market value. The highest percentage that you can do is 80%. So you can sell a property for 80% of the fair market value and then get a tax credit for the 20% that you donate. And you can donate any proportion you would like, as long as it's at least 20%. If you want to sell the property for 1% of the fair market value and donate 99, that is an option. You just can't sell it for more than 80%, or on the flip side of that coin, you can't donate less than 20% in this split receipt option. So those are all the fee simple ways that we protect land. It really is our most straight up version. There is another version that is a little more complicated, but achieves something very different that I think is really, really cool. And that is a conservation easement agreement. And this is a way that a landowner can actually conserve a piece of property without giving up ownership of it. And they do this by donating the development rights to it. And the mechanism for that is a legal agreement called the conservation easement agreement. And basically what happens with a conservation easement is we sit down with the landowner, usually over a series of conversations, and we essentially write a will for the property with them. We ask them, what the big values are in the property when it comes to conservation. We ask them, what parts of the property they're still using. A lot of time they have a house on the property, or agricultural fields that they still want to work. And they still want to be able to use these things as, a landowner has the right to do on their property. But they also want to conserve maybe the back 40 that has a wetland and a patch of forest, or something like that. And so this is the way that a lot of people go about achieving that. The restrictions that we write are all surrounding the protection of the nature and prevention of its destruction. When we are working on these, we can actually designate areas that are in or out of protection. And we can actually do this in a very simple way. I can go in on my mapping software, or I can walk the property with a GPS unit, and we can draw a line across the property. So if you've got like a 1 acre housing lot and a hay field, and then 50 acres of forest in the back 50 of your property, we can draw a line that basically says, okay, everything on this side of the line is in the quote protected area. Here in this area, you're not allowed to cut down trees. You're not allowed to build anything. You're not allowed to turn it into an airstrip or a parking lot or a condominium. But on the other side of the line, the area that may have the house and the agricultural fields, we basically say this is not in the protected area. So here you are free to do things like improve your house. You're free to, build, tear down the house and build a new one if you'd like. You're free to work those fields as you do to produce food. And in that way, it allows people to really customize what the protection looks like on their property. The other really useful thing about the conservation easement is that because the owner retains the ownership of the property, they also retain the right to sell the property. But when they sell the property or when they pass it along to their kids or do whatever they're planning to do with it, the easement follows the title. So when it goes to change hands, whoever the incoming party is will have to write a letter and sign an agreement that basically says, yes, I have seen, I have read, and I understand this conservation easement agreement, and I agree to purchase this property with the conservation easement in place. And then once they purchase the property, they are bound by all of the same rules that the original landowner set out in their will for the property when it comes to writing this conservation easement. Each year, the land trust will then visit the property to assess whether that easement is being followed by the landowner. And in cases where the landowner breaks the easement, causes ecological damage in some way, or otherwise does something that they're not allowed to do there, they are legally responsible for undoing that damage and for paying for remediation. In most cases, these sorts of things are accidental, are involuntary, that sort of thing. And I'm happy to say at TIWLT, we've had very few to no issues with our easements so far. Our easement holders have been absolutely incredible and very conservation-minded folks. However, TIWLT is an organization that works on the timescale of forever. And when you work on the timescale of forever, you have to consider all possibilities. And so we have to imagine that at some point between now and the end of time, one of these easement properties may come into the hands of somebody who is not conservation minded, who is maybe angry about the easement or doesn't think that they need to follow it or anything like that, and may even in some cases willingly cause harm to a property that has an easement on it. When that happens, TIWLT has the power to go all the way up to litigation in court to fix any damage that might be caused. And we have the not just the right to do that, but the obligation to do that so that we can protect the original wishes of the landowner who put that easement on in the first place. But of course, that's an extreme case. Most easement issues can be worked out with just a sit down, a conversation, and a handshake. But if we need to break out the big guns, so to speak, we do have the ability to do that to protect the conservation and to protect the ecological values that it was conserved for in the first place. The final way that we acquire property is kind of new to the land trust, and this is a sale or direct purchase. This is where the land trust buys a property. And because we're organizations that work with a lot of foundation or government grants, as well as primarily the generous donations of our supporters, this is something that we save for the absolutely, incredible properties. To the point that Don said, at the beginning here, we're in our 31st year. To my knowledge, or at least as long as I've been here, the land trust has only outright purchased 3 properties. One of which, I'm happy to say, actually closed today. There's going to be a little bit more of an announcement on that to come. But 3 properties that are all ecologically incredible, whether it be because of their species at risk, whether it be because of their location in relation to other protected areas, their spot on the landscape. For whatever reason, these properties are incredible. And so these are the ones that we consider for direct purchase. The only thing to note with this is that direct purchases don't go through the ecological gifts program. They're not a donation. They are a business transaction. And so there is no tax break that is given to the seller when that deal is made. So those are the main ways that people can donate. And that's what we have. We talk a lot about that at the beginning in this preliminary conversation. And eventually people get back to us, or maybe they make a decision in the moment and say, this is the option that's right for me. Let's get going. And when that happens, we move on to ecological assessment. This is the point of the process where a biologist will visit the property, or oftentimes a team of biologists will visit the property and walk around. We'll take a look at species. We'll make a species list. We're going to look around for things like sensitive ecosystems. We're going to look for threats like invasive species or signs of trespass. We're going to look for rare species, interesting areas, and geological features. There's a whole laundry list of things that we're looking for. And this is all to build a case for the ecology of the property. Alongside our regular activities, if it warrants it, sometimes we do more intensive monitoring, such as, look how happy we are to be armpit deep in a swamp here. This is some work that I was actually able to do with in conjunction with Thousand Islands National Park to do some seed netting on a property that we were in talks with the landowner. That project didn't actually end up coming to fruition, but this is the sort of thing we thought, this is exactly the kind of place where pug-nosed shiner might live, and that's an endangered minnow. And so we thought, well, if we can get some support from the national park, we can do some seed netting, we can see if they're there, and if they are, all the better. And the national park was more than happy to help us out with that. Now, you might be asking why? Why do we do this ecological assessment? Why do we go to so much trouble to go swimming with all of our clothes on and do this? Well, that's because we have to prove when we conserve a property that the property is worth conserving. And we have to prove that to ourselves. We have to prove that to the government if it's going through the ecological gifts program. And most importantly, we have to prove that to our supporters who so generously, give money, time, and talent to the land trust. We have to prove that we are using those resources in a responsible way. And so we create these reports that qualify properties as ecologically sensitive. And I said there was a whole list of things that we look for. Thankfully, they make our job pretty easy here in Ontario, and they give us to them in this very convenient list right here. Now, the text is very small. It needs to be to fit everything on this one page. But basically, all you need to know is that along the left-hand side, those are our primary criteria. There are 19 things that we have in the back of our minds when we're on a property that we're looking for. And these are the big ones when it comes to conservation. These are species at risk. These are provincially significant wetlands, areas of natural and scientific interest. There's one here that says if an area is within a UNESCO biosphere reserve, it qualifies for that criteria. There's all sorts of various plans and things for various ecologically sensitive parts of Ontario that are represented here. These are the big, large-scale ecological features that would warrant protection of a property. On the right-hand side, you can see we've got these secondary criteria or these general criteria, and there are 11 of those. And they are more general. These are things where the things on the left are really applied to very specific types of ecosystems, specific species, specific areas of the province. The ones on the right, the secondary criteria, are much more general. These are things like places that are zoned as significant woodlands, areas that have a high gathering of wildlife, areas that are natural links or corridors to other ecologically sensitive lands. These are the much more general criteria. And the great thing is that in order to conserve a property under the Ecological Gifts Program, all you need is one from each list, one specific and one general. Now, that's not to say that we find the first one and then stop. Most of the time when we're writing these reports, we'll have 5, 6, 7 of these in a single report from each list. And so we build the best case that we can, and we apply as many of these that we can. But the great thing is that you only need one of each. And the greater thing is that here on the Frontenac Arch, these are very, very easy to find. We're in an area that is extremely ecologically sensitive as a whole. Even, among Southern Ontario, I would wager it's maybe the most ecologically sensitive part of the southern half of the province. And so we rarely have trouble proving ecological sensitivity to any of the people that are listening. So we've gone out, we've tromped through the mud, we've walked through a swamp. Now comes time to come back to the desk and do a little bit of paperwork. And this is still a key part of ecological assessment because now we need to prove it. We found these species, we found these ecosystems. Let's prove that that we found them and prove that these properties are worth conserving. And we have three main documents that we create when we do this. Each serves a different purpose and gives different information, but all of them are designed to give information about the ecology of the land. The first is called the Ecological Sensitivity Report, or ESR. And this is the one that we actually send into the government. We send this into Environment Climate Change Canada when we're going through the Ecological Gifts program. This is a look at the ecology of the property at the time of donation. And this is the one that we use to prove to the government that the land is worth serving. And this is actually the document that we use that we're making when we're looking at those A and B criteria. This is where we put those in. And as I said, we consider all sorts of things within those A and B criteria: species present, zoning, land use, threats to the property. We look at positive and the negative. And the idea is just to get a holistic view of the ecology of the property. That's the purpose of the Ecological Sensitivity Report. The next one that we do is the Baseline Documentation Report. And this is similar, but this is more a snapshot of the property's condition at the time of donation. Whereas I kind of see the Ecological Sensitivity Report, it is, as much as a scientific paper can be, it's an opinion piece. It's us saying, here are all the reasons that we think this property is worthy of conservation. I think you should agree. The Baseline Documentation Report is where we go, and it's a much more objective exercise. We go and we say, okay, on this part of the property, there is this feature. We saw this species in this place. If there's any buildings, we go and we get a GPS coordinate for the building, and we get all of its dimensions, and we report on its condition. We basically take as many angles as we can here to get as good of a snapshot of the property's condition as we can. And the reason for that, the reason we have to be so thorough with this, is that this is what we measure all future changes against to see how much damage a future action may have done to the property. So if 30, 40, 50 years from now, whoever's running TIWLT, if it isn't me, is going out to a property and they see an area has been clear cut, well, they can go back to this Baseline Documentation Report and say, there should be a forest here, and here's the proof. And that is how we create our basis for action when damage is done to our properties. These are by the land trust standards and practices. These are only required for conservation easement agreements, that one where you can still retain ownership but protect your land. But TIWLT has decided that it is best practice to create one of these for all of our properties. And so we're in the process of doing that now, because this is a very important piece of paperwork to have to kind of ensure our operations in the future. The last piece of paperwork that we do is called the Property Management Plan. And this one is very straightforward. This is our plan for how best to manage and steward the property. And this mostly goes toward addressing any of the negatives that we may have found when we were writing the Ecological Sensitivity Report, that first document that we talked about. So here we talk about, we do things like make plans for eliminating invasive species, take actions to minimize trespass, and any other property-specific stewardship actions. Like, you would be very surprised how often you're out in the woods and you find like an old dryer in the middle of the woods. And well, it'd be part of the property management plan to figure out how we're going to get that, hike that 4 kilometers out of the woods. That's what we're doing with this here. And sometimes the best management is no management. If we have an ecologically pristine property and we can't find anything that needs fixing, we're not gonna fix a problem that isn't there. And so we will return to the property, as we do all of our properties. We go back every single year and we monitor for new damage. We see what changes have taken place in the past year. And if there's nothing to report on, then we say, that's great, amazing. We're gonna keep our eyes peeled, but no further action is required. And sometimes we do find damage and we have to investigate that, look into it, and potentially solve it. These tend to stand for 5 years, and then we review them and update them and re-implement them. And that just makes sure that everything stays fresh. Okay, so we've talked to the landowner. Everybody's on board. We have all of the ecological sensitivity reporting is done. We've gotten the note back from the government. Yes, this is a property worth conserving. Go on ahead. And we move to appraisal and submission. This is the part where we calculate the tax credit. And it all starts by inviting an appraiser out to the property to appraise it, to give it a value. That valuation is based on the highest and best use of the property. So basically, the appraiser comes and says, what would be the use of the property that would net the greatest value to the landowner? Sometimes it's a single dwelling, a rural home. Sometimes it is to chop it up into lots and sell off those lots for a subdivision. It could be anything. They value the property based on what the highest and best use would be. And then that valuation is the basis for the tax credit. And that depends on the method of donation that you chose in step one, whether it's fee simple, conservation easement, or a purchase. Well, purchase doesn't get any tax credit, so that's an easy one. The appraiser needs to have specific qualifications to appraise ecological gifts. And that means that it's very important for us to have a good relationship with our appraiser. And we have a great appraiser that we work with out of Kingston. They've done work for the Land Trust for a long time, and they have this qualification. So it's a really good setup for us. Once the appraiser writes their report, they appraise the property, they assign it a dollar value. That gets sent to the Appraisal Review Board, which works under Environment Climate Change Canada. That Appraisal Review Board is a group of people that have a lot of experience with ecological gift appraisals, and they basically go through the document, review the value, and give it a yay or nay. What they will do, excuse me, what they will do is they'll look at the value that's given to the property, and they will say either, yep, that looks good, rubber stamp yes, and send it back, or they'll say, actually, based on our experience and our expertise in this field, we actually think that the true value of the property is this different number, this X number. Once they've determined that, they've made that decision, they send a document back to the landowner that says, this is what the Appraisal Review Board thinks your property is worth. Sometimes it matches what the original appraiser did. Sometimes it changes a little bit with what the original appraiser did, with an explanation of why. Once they see that valuation, the landowner can choose to give it a thumbs up, say, yep, that works for me, and let's continue. They can say, oh, I don't actually think that's true. I don't want to continue with this process, and they can back out of the entire process at that point. Or they can say, I think you may have made a mistake. I'd like you to take a second look at this, and they can request a reassessment from that Appraisal Review Board. If they accept the value that comes back from the Appraisal Review Board, or if they request a reassessment and then accept what the reassessed value is, that is the number that is used to calculate the tax credit. I'm going to talk about that tax credit now, but the first thing I have to tell you is that I am a biologist. I am not a tax accountant. I'm not any kind of accountant. And so this is not meant to be taken as tax advice. In fact, back in step one, when we're having that conversation with people, the first thing that we always say is to get independent legal and tax advice and accounting advice, because this is a very big decision and it does get very complicated. That said, I've done quite a few of these properties by now, and I do know more or less how it shakes out. So they use the value of the property, the fair market value, to generate the tax credit. For a fee simple donation, apologies. For a fee simple donation where the property is just straight up donated to the land trust, you use 100% of that appraised value of the property to generate that credit. Depending on your individual tax scenario, that doesn't necessarily mean that the realized dollar value of your tax savings is going to be equal to 100% of the value of the property. That, again, is a question for your tax accountant. but it usually comes out to be a percentage of that based on your individual tax scenario. For conservation easement, the credit is actually calculated based on the value of the easement itself. So when we do one of these, the appraiser actually goes to the property, appraises it with no conservation easement on it, and then we send them a copy of the finished conservation easement that we've agreed to with the landowner, and they appraise it again as if the easement was on the property. Then they take the before value, they subtract the after value, and that gives them the value of the easement, which is functionally the value of the rights, the development rights that the owner is giving up in entering into that easement agreement. And the value of those rights is what the tax credit is based off of. For a split receipt property, which you'll remember is that partial donation where you sell for a percentage of the fair market value and donate the remainder, the credit for that is based just on the donated portion of the property. So if you sell for 80% of your fair market value and donate 20% of the property, you get a tax credit for 20% of the appraised value of the property, loosely. Again, it all really depends on your individual tax scenario. Now, this is a pretty good tax credit, but it gets better. I think that the government was astounded that people were interested in doing this. And so they decided that the pot needed to be even sweeter for those who are willing to make such a big decision for their property and for the benefit, really, of all of us when it comes to conserving ecologically sensitive land. So they added a few extras onto it to make it overall better than the regular tax receipt you get for a charitable donation. First and foremost, you can carry this forward for up to 10 years. So if you donate a $1 million property and you think there's no way you're going to use $1 million of tax credits in a single year, you don't have to. You have up to 10 years to use that tax credit in its entirety. There is also no limit on how much of the credit can be used in a single year, which would allow you, if you have enough tax credits, to completely eliminate your income tax for the year and potentially for multiple years, depending on your tax scenario, which can be a great way to save a little bit of extra money. Finally, and this is the real kicker, this is the one that really gets a lot of people excited. No property that changes hands after or as part of an ecological gifts program donation is subject to the capital gains tax. So we see a lot of the time people who purchased or maybe inherited properties back in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and now, especially since the pandemic, the value of that property has skyrocketed. And when it comes time to dispose of it, even as a donation, they stand to pay a very large capital gains tax. But if you go through the ecological gifts program, that capital gains tax, the exact wording is the inclusion rate is equal to 0%, which means you don't pay it. It's important to note that for a conservation easement agreement, which you'll remember is where the landowner maintains ownership and maintains the right to sell. When they sell the property, when the original owner that put the easement on sells the property, they don't pay capital gains tax on it. But when the next owner sells the property, they do. Only the original donor gets that capital gains tax forgiveness. So these are the extras. These are what makes this really an above and beyond kind of tax credit. And honestly, if you're asking me, I think it's the best deal that you will probably ever get from the federal government. So that's it. That's the Coles Notes version of our process. I would say, depending on how complicated a project gets from beginning to end, it usually takes a minimum of 3 months to go through this process with all of the field work and the paperwork that we have to write and waiting on the government to send us back documents. But the upper limit of that is quite long, to be perfectly honest, depending on how complicated the project gets. Most projects take less than 1 calendar year, which is still sounds like a very long time, but we've had some projects go even beyond that. So that's what I would say the average is. Just as a reminder, a quick overview. We start with notification and discovery. And after that, we meet people, we decide, this is what we want to do. We're very interested in continuing. And then we go to ecological assessment. We have a look at the property. We have a look at all of the ecological value of it. We prove that to the government, to ourselves, and to our donors and our supporters. And if all is good there, it's an ecologically sensitive property, which most are in this area. We move to appraisal and submission. We calculate that tax credit. And at the end of it, we pop a bottle of champagne and celebrate having saved a piece of property forever. Now, this is a really great process. The next logical question that everybody asks is, what does it cost? Because even though it's a donation, even though it's a charitable donation, this is a very expensive process for the land trust to go through. Even in cases where land is donated, there is significant cost to processing a new property acquisition. We have to get that high quality appraisal from a certified appraiser. That report itself costs between $3,500 and $4,000 alone. We have to get legal fees related to property transfer and easement registration. We are lucky here at TIWLT specifically that we are oftentimes offered pro bono work from the lawyers that we work with. And we're extremely thankful for that when it's offered, but we never assume that. We never operate under the assumption that we won't be paying legal fees. And in a lot of cases, we do pay legal fees. So this is always something that we have to be mindful of and saving for. There's a cost to buy title documents, especially when we do a title search. We have to make sure the title for the property is clear. We have to buy a lot of those documents, which can be a cost that really racks up. Staff time takes an immense amount of people power, between biologists and project management. We have to negotiate with the landowners. We have to do the ecological assessment. We have to manage all of the professional services that we're getting. It takes an incredible amount of time to process one of these donations, and I have to make sure that my staff is getting paid. And so that's another really big part of the budget when it comes to conserving. There are ongoing costs to monitor and steward. As I said, we go back to our properties every single year. And if there's damage on them, we start to make a plan about how we can fix that. And whatever the cost is, it's our responsibility to do that. And so there are the costs of both getting to those properties. I mean, some are only accessible by boat. We drive all over the watershed in the summertime getting to these properties. And there are all of those costs that we have to take into account as well. And finally, we have this mandatory contribution of 10% of the appraised value to the Forever Fund. And this part of it is so special, I'm going to give it its own slide. The Forever Fund is maybe the most important pool of money that the land trust holds on to. We've established it relatively recently, and it's grown quite a bit in the past little while, but it still has a ways to go before it's at the point that we want it to be at. And essentially, what the Forever Fund is exactly what the name suggests. This is the money that we put aside to fund emergency property action at some point in the future when it might be needed. This is equal to 10% of the value of all the land property holdings that we have. And so that is the baseline. That's what a lot of land trusts use as sort of the best practice. Some land trusts are just starting to bump that number up to 15%, 20%. And right now, TIWLT is socking away as much money as we can for this, because this really is our insurance policy for the future. We can use this to pay for property remediation. We can use this to pursue legal action in cases where properties are damaged by third parties. We can use it for anything that would save a property, essentially, and nothing else. We're not able to draw from this fund to cover operations costs. I can't pay my staff out of this fund. We can't use it to buy property. This is our insurance policy for the future. And this is how we ensure that the board and the executive director and the staff from now until the end of time are going to be able to keep this promise of forever, that we are going to maintain these properties for eternity. While it may feel like it's unused money at this point in time, it is, according to me, I think, our most important fund, as it ensures the work that we do can last forever.
So that's a basic overview of the process that we have to go through and a few of the nuts and bolts that we have to work with when we're conserving property forever. If you couldn't tell, I'm very passionate about this stuff and I love to talk about it. So I will be thrilled and happy to answer any questions that you might have following the presentation. But otherwise, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us for the first Conservation Cafe of 2024. Have a great night, everybody.